Hi, this is my video about the Lodz Ghetto. The Lodz Ghetto, Lodz. Lodz is founded about 140 km southwest of the capital city, Warsaw in Poland. Before any wars, the Jews living in Lodz were the second biggest Jewish community, which consisted of 223,000 Jews out of 665,000 people that lived in Lodz. Of course, Warsaw being the capital, it had the most Jews. Germany had invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939 but occupied Lodz 7 days later on the 8th of September 1939. Lodz was now part of Germany from the 9th of November 1939 and was named Listmanstadt on the 11th of April 1940 after a man named Karl Listmann, who was a German World War I general. There had been a couple of other ghettos built in other cities in Poland, but the amount of Jewish people living in there had been very small compared to the ghetto in Lodz or Warsaw. Those ghettos had stayed open, meaning other Jews and civilians could enter the ghetto. At the time, Lodz had a Jewish population said to be around 130,000. What did the ghetto look like? Only for a little while, when the ghetto was only starting, 1/3 of the land that was the ghetto was empty. Sooner or later, the whole area was covered in factories. Since September 1942, the ghetto had become a single large factory and the Jews were still forced to work. Today, since the ongoing wars, only the old camp administrative building remains at 34 Persenslosa Street. The ghetto in Lodz. The ghetto was northeast of Lodz. More than 160,000 Jews that were living in Lodz were made to live in a small area that was 4.3 km squared. To keep everyone who is not a Jew out of this area before the ghetto could be built, it put a warning on January 17, 1940, telling them the area is planned for the ghetto. They ordered to build of the Lodz Ghetto on February 8, 1940. They thought they would be able to set up the ghetto in one day. Not only did it take more than one day, but it was also a lot more difficult than anticipated. It had taken them weeks to build the ghetto, and when finally built, they started to move the Jews in. The Jews had a couple of minutes to pack what they wanted. In April, a fence with barbed wire surrounding the outskirts of the ghetto was placed and had 24/7 police officers surrounding it. On the 30th of April 1940, the ghetto was closed, and a day later, the Lodz Ghetto was officially sealed. Since the ghetto was sealed on the 1st of May 1940, the ghetto was relatively quiet and calm, since the Jews knew that they weren't just sealed. They were locked in the ghetto. It also led to a good thing that no one from the outside could enter, and torturing Jews through forced labor and sometimes even random beatings. Some even thought that was a good thing of being sealed off, thinking they would be safe from the outside world. What they did not realize was that the ghetto was a temporary place for the Jews until they would eventually die due to starvation and other reasons at the ghetto or in mobile gas chambers. Lodz was becoming the center of the new and better textile industry in Poland before the war. With that knowledge, they decided to enslave Jews to make a profit out of them. The Jews were made to work for everything, for food, security, sewage removal, and everything else which were necessary to be able to withstand the living conditions there. By the end of the year 1942, there were over 74 workshops, factories the Jews were working at. 44,000 Jews had died by the end of 1942 because of colds, diseases, working too much, and many more reasons why. Only at the ghetto, excluding all the Jews that died in concentration camp, also known as mobile gas chambers. The exact number of Jews that went to the concentration camp is difficult to know, as many of the records are missing. The conditions at the ghetto. Living in the ghetto was absolutely awful. Most of the area that was considered the ghetto didn't have running water nor a sewer system. That means that the place stank like sewage, and they were dirty and also stank. But that was the least of their problems. They had to deal with being in such a small area with thousands of people. They had to deal with being starved and having to work hard labor. For working extremely hard, they barely got enough food to survive, hence they had to deal with starvation. What did the kids do at the ghetto? Young kids stitched clothes, made straw shoes, mended knapsacks, and straightened out needles. As expected, many of them died of starvation and from fevers and colds. Some of the children that fell ill were sent to the hospital at 74 Dworska Street in the ghetto. Some were executed. Deportations to the Lodz Ghetto in the years 1941 and 1942. Another 38,000 people were deported to the ghetto, mainly from nearby places. From the 16th of October and the 3rd of November 1941, 5,000 Jews were deported to Lodz, and because of the poor condition, poor weather, no food nor water, only 277 Jews survived and were forced to work at the ghetto. 20,000 people were deported from Germany, Austria, Luxembourg, Moravia, and Bohemia. Another 20,000 people were deported from small towns in Warthgway. They were made to be in a small block of buildings. Together, Approximately 210,000 people had no other option but to live in the Lodz Ghetto. Deportations from the Lodz Ghetto. From the beginning of the year 1942, when the Germans began to deport Jews to a town called Chalmon from the ghetto, where they would be killed using mobile gas chambers. Starting on January 6, 1942, those who were made to be deported were nicknamed wedding invitations. Approximately 1,000 people were leaving for Chalmon per day by train. At the Chalmon, they were gassed by carbon monoxide in trucks. By January 19, 1942, 10,000 people had been deported to Chelmon. After a few weeks had passed, the Nazis wanted to deport more Jews. To make it easier for themselves, they slowed the delivery of food to the ghetto. They did that so they could then tell the Jews they would get a meal on the transport. From February 20 to April 2, 1942, approximately 34,000 people were transported to Chelmon, but by the end of April 1942, 60,000 people were murdered using gas. After they deported the Jews, another request was sent for even more Jews. This time they particularly wanted only the newcomers that had come from other parts of the Reich. Any of the newcomers with a German or an Austrian military honor were not deported. In September 1942, there was another request for deportation to Chelmon. But this time they wanted everyone enabled to work fast and efficiently. This included sick, old, and young people. The parents of the young children didn't want their child to be deported, so the Gestapo had to enter and take the deportees. After the month of September 1942, the deportations were nearly put to an end as the German army was desperate for more ammunition. Because of it, the residents of the ghetto were worked, hungered, and mourned for nearly 2 years. In the spring of 1944, the Nazis decided to completely destroy the Lodz Ghetto. They decided to do so as it was the last ghetto to stand. By the year 1944, during the month of May, the Lodz Ghetto had approximately 75,000 Jews. In the months of June and July, the Germans resumed deporting the Jews to Chelmon and Auschwitz. 7,000 people were deported during those months. The rest of the Jews living in the ghetto were deported to Auschwitz to a mobile gas chamber. Only a small fraction of Jews were left behind at the ghetto and were responsible for sorting all the possessions of the Jews that were deported. German occupation. For the Lodz Ghetto, the Nazis decided to make one Jew responsible for the entire Jewish population. The Nazis chose Mordecai Rankowski. He was 62 years old and had white hair. He held many jobs, including being a factory manager, an insurance agent, and a director of the Hellenok orphanage, all before the war even began. In 1941, Rankowski had become engaged and soon married Regina Weinberger, who was a young lawyer. Rankowski and his vision. No one knew why the Germans chose Mordecai as the Altesti elder of the Jews. Maybe because the Nazis thought that he would help them by organizing the Jews, or did he want to make them feel that way to help the Jews escape? We will know in just a bit. Rankowski was a strong believer in the independence of the ghetto. He started to have a government of his own in the ghetto, different from the rest of Lodz. He also replaced the German Reichsmark with his own ghetto money, which had his face printed onto it. He also created his own post office and sold stamps with his face on them too. He also created a cleanup department for the ghetto's sewage system, since the ghetto didn't yet have one, but soon realized that attaining food was the problem. Hunger. Later in the months, there were 230,000 people made to live on a very small piece of land that had no way of growing food on itself. Food was quickly becoming a major problem. Since the Jews had to pay for everything in the ghetto, to get food, they needed money. But how would they make enough money when they were robbed of all their valuables and locked away from the rest of society? Well, Rankowski thought that if the ghetto became a very useful workforce, then the Nazis would realize how much they are relying on the Jews. Thus, the Nazis would make sure the Jews are kept well. On April 5, 1940, Mordecai Rankowski demanded that the Nazi authorities would take his plan to take action. He told the Nazis that they would sustain the ghetto with raw materials, then have the Jews make the final products, and after that, the Nazis would pay the Jews in money and in food. On April 30th, 1940, Rankowski's suggestion was accepted with a very important change. The Jews would only be paid in food and not with money. A flaw in Rankowski's plan was that it was never decided how much and how often they would be fed. Rankowski himself began setting up factories. All people that were able and willing to work found jobs relatively easily. To be working at most factories, you had to be over 14 years of age. But there were some factories that children could take part in. The mica splitting factories were designed for smaller kids. Adults working in the factories produced many different textiles and even weaponry itself. Young girls were taught how to hand-stitch the emblems for the uniforms of German soldiers. For all this hard work, the Nazis were delivering them food in bulk, but as soon as the food entered the grounds of the ghetto, Rumkowski's officers confiscated them so Rumkowski could distribute the food himself. With this new system in place, Rumkowski had become the ruler of the ghetto. The quality and the quantity of food delivered to the ghetto were less than enough for survival, especially since most of it was spoiled. Ration cards were quickly put into effect for food on June 2nd, 1940. Each person got a different amount of food from each other as it depended on how much work you have done. More dangerous factories gave a bit more bread than others, but office workers received the most. An average factory worker received a bowl of soup. If you were lucky enough, you would get a couple of barley beans floating in it, one loaf of bread, a small number of vegetables, and brown water that was supposed to be coffee for every 5 days, and later it would be for every 7. This amount of food was beginning to starve people to death. As the ghetto residents began feeling hunger, they became increasingly suspicious of Rumkowski and his officials. Rumors started Rumkowski had to make a public announcement labeling them as traitors to the cause. Rumkowski believed that these people were an immediate threat to his work ethic, thus punishing them and later deporting them. Thank you for watching my video.